thinks we can read their mind. They take umbrage when we don't. Oh, love gives you eyes and wisdom, and you should know that by now, without talking about it. It's one of the myths that love doesn't give you the ability to read your beloved's mind, although you may, on occasion, match up, and it gives you a little smile on your face that for just once we're thinking about the same thing at the same time. How do you read a king's mind? What's behind that question anyway? Well, I'm going to talk the next few lectures. Oh boy. I'm going to have a fight with my computer thanks to Microsoft all day. Wants to force me to allow something that I want to deny. We're going to talk about some things of wisdom from the book of Daniel. We're not going to talk in the same way that we would in the evangelistic series. There's a certain way we analyze those passages for prophetic lectures, but we're going to cover the same material, but looking instead for wisdom. Wisdom for us who are already believers, perhaps. So the story begins around 603 BC with Nebuchadnezzar besieging Jerusalem, gaining entrance, hauling off a lot of the temple and king's treasures. Along with it took the cream of the crop, the intelligentsia of the nation of Judah, the princes, others who have been going to rabbinic schools, etc., craftsmen, the best artists, the best builders, artisans, to enrich Babylon, enrich the wisdom pool of Babylon. Of course, along this way, there was going to come a 70-year exile because of about two main things. Number one was the idolatry of Judah, the drifting away from God. But also part of that was the greed of the people kept them from faithfully keeping the Sabbath and allowing the land to keep its Sabbath. The Jubilees were only token attended to. And so there was this idea that the land itself was going to be able to celebrate the missing Sabbaths and be rejuvenated over these 70 years. Well, there's Daniel and his three companions. They're before the king. We hope to be able to enlarge upon the drama in chapter 1 a little bit, detailed later on again in our series. But for now, we know that they were tested by the whole rite of passage from being citizens of Judah to being pawns for Babylon. Had the individuality altered, had surgical recovery. They pled to have their simple diet be the surgery recovery diet. And the man who was issuing all this was afraid they would sicken and die and it'd be his head, so they pled for just 10 days. And after 10 days, you could tell the difference that a diet, King James Version calls pulse. Pulse is good for your pulse. That simple vegetables and fruits and grains actually is the best way to go through life. And then they embarked upon a series of classes. Don't know what was involved in that curriculum, but there was language and there was mysteries and there was science as they understood it. There was all these sort of categories of knowledge, and then came the day which they had to pass their comprehensives. And the Bible says that they tested out, and it may be hyperbole, but it may be accurate, they tested out 10 times better than even their smartest professors. And so they were awarded entrance into a class of counselors of the realm called the vaunted Magi. And of course, they still were newbies, and they didn't gain immediate respect from anybody except the king who had oversaw the testing. Well, it was soon after that King Nebuchadnezzar spent a restless night. He had trouble getting to sleep because he was concerned with his kingdom after himself. He probably asked himself, is my kingdom really dependent upon my charisma, my own wisdom, my own leadership? Can I engineer a culture of Babylon? Can somehow we develop a system so it doesn't matter who the king is, that Babylon will endure from generation to generation, and nobody can be so bad as to cause its downfall? And so he was thinking about this idea of Babylon living on as a dynasty forever. Now, this is an audacious kind of dream he had, a vision, because there had not been a world power up till his time. It was a new generation, a new era. It was almost like the year 2022, where we're right on the cusp of a whole new era. We'll get into that in a little bit, but some of us who've been around know that things are happening quite differently now than they were even just 2 years ago, much less 20 years ago. Things are really different. So he had a dream. Actually, he had dreams. If you're good at reading, you'll pick up on the fact he had more than one dream. Or let's put it this way, I think the evidence will suggest he had the same dream more than once. So he had a dream given to him twice. It's as though he had a dream, he woke up, and he couldn't remember the dream, and he was very concerned about that, anxious a lot, and so he thought, maybe if I go back to sleep, maybe it'll come back to me, and so he goes back to sleep, and he dreams the exact same dream. But it doesn't do any good, because when he wakes up the second time, he still knows he has dreamed the same dream, but he can't remember the details to talk about, to have interpreted. He didn't understand it. Now, anciently, in his day and age, people thought that the gods would take the time when you were asleep to communicate to you. And so they could get into your mind, they could actually put stuff into your mind to help you through life. We sort of replaced all that pantheon of gods with science and human engineering, bioengineering, psychoengineering, psychocybernetics. We have all kinds of things, but the ultimate thing is that if we hook up people's minds to computers, we believe we can extract and find what they're thinking and relay it and discover the secrets of their memories. It's all the brave new frontier that we're at right now that previous generations have looked into. They've been stymied, they've been frustrated by the inability to do very much with reading people's minds. But Dr. Michio Kaku, professor of theoretical physics, City University of New York, has written a book, The Future of the Mind, and he has a fertile mind of his own. He has some ideas which are a little bit bold, but I thought you might be entertained with what he wrote some years ago now, what would happen in 10 years. Took this from a web page dated way back in 2015, 7 years ago. In the next 10 years, we will see the gradual transition from an internet to a brain net, in which thoughts, emotions, feelings, memories might be transmitted instantly across the planet. Scientists can now hook up the brain to a computer, begin to decode. Begin to decode is the interesting phrase, begin to decode some of our memories and our thoughts. This might eventually revolutionize communication and even entertainment. He takes a little flight of fancy. If you're young, and you might be entertained by this. Movies of the future will be able to convey emotions and feelings, not just images on a silver screen. Teenagers will go crazy on social media, sending memories and sensation from their senior prom, their first date, etc., so that their companions can see exactly how they were experiencing that event. Historians and writers will be able to record events not just digitally, but also emotionally as well. They can just put in the feelings of the moment in the document. So he's hopeful of all this prying in behind consciousness and getting involved to reading people's mind. Perhaps even tensions between people will diminish as people begin to feel and experience the pain of others. But I think that the human nature, human state has prepared some of us to be a bit more cynical rather than hopeful. If people get this ability to get inside the mind of other people, the strong will control the weak. They will seek to tell you how to think, tell you what to think, and penalize you for not thinking what they want you to think. Well, I've looked at this, and the best news about all this is that very little of that gap has been closed in the first 7 years of that prophecy. It may be on the way to happening, but we're not quite on schedule. Dr. James Canton, CEO of the San Francisco-based Institute for Global Futures, the author of Future Smart, Managing the Game-Changing Trends that will transform your world. He's thinking about change coming. And of course, the smart, the wealthy, the powerful will have insight, and they will manage this change. Maybe you would like to manage some of the changes that you've seen happen in the last 24 months, but you haven't been able to manage it, but you would like to. But here's what he said: by 2025, AI, artificial intelligence, machine intelligence, becomes both as smart and smarter than humans. AI will be embedded in autos, in robots, in homes, and hospitals. It'll create an AI economy. Humans and robots will merge digitally and physically to treat patients who may be around the world. On the other side of the world, you can treat a patient. They don't have to be in your office. Robo-surgeons will operate remotely on patients. They don't have to make it to your hospital. Robo-docs will deliver babies and treat you over the cell phone. The person is not significant, it's the service. And if you can do it by automation, then the human is discounted as not near as important as it used to be. Predictive medicine transforms healthcare. Personalized genetic medicine will prevent disease. We can plug you in and maybe do a little pinprick, take a blood sample, and get your genome captured and run that past the file of the diseases you're resistant to, the diseases you're susceptible to, and that way they can save lives and save billions in lost productivity. But again, there's a dark shadow to all this. If you are likely to come down with a disease, you could be discriminated in the job market as being a poor risk on their healthcare system. They would have to pay out more to keep you going. The next generation, Bitcoin, he concludes, will replace traditional hard money. I think we already made it to the next generation, but there's another generation coming. We'll create a new paradigm for digital commerce, business that will create a legitimate new economy. What if it takes over all the economy? What if that is the defining medium of the global economy, is a digital kind of coin that goes into your digital personal account, which could be canceled at any time for some reason that they don't like you anymore. So how would you set up a demonstration of what is the ultimate source of wisdom? And I'm going to define the ultimate source of wisdom would be knowledge to solve a human problem that no one has ever been able to solve before. That would be the ultimate wisdom you could find, at least on planet Earth, would be being able to solve an unsolvable problem. Now, that was God's problem back in circa 600 BC. He needed to reach King Nebuchadnezzar's proud mind. Kings aren't used to taking counsel or advice, and certainly if you're very far off the mark, they're not apt to listen. But God wanted to reach Nebuchadnezzar because he had a desire for him. He saw good in him. Yes, he was pagan, and he certainly probably had a dark side to his character, but he had done many good things, and God wanted to reach him in a way that could save him from the worst of himself, and that it would allow him to better live out the plan God had for his life rather than what Nebuchadnezzar had thought for his life. And the main thing about Nebuchadnezzar's life was he needed to understand that the law of consequences goes beyond the here and the now. Everyone lives a life which will be judged by the Creator God. And Nebuchadnezzar was confused about that. He had a whole pantheon of gods, and he probably thought if there was a judgment God, he could appeal to another God that would counteract that judgment God. And so Nebuchadnezzar needed a little object lesson to know how to prepare for the judgment of the true God. To that end, God chose a sequence of these two identical dreams, both of which he programmed Nebuchadnezzar to forget. He remembered they had happened. He remembered they were the same, but he had forgotten every defining detail. So he couldn't call in anybody to say, interpret my dream. But in a panic, he calls all the magi, and Daniel and his three friends, although they were part of that, were left behind. The magi were dismissive of these four new novices, so they didn't get the interview with the king that night. And it was an emergency interview. It was sometime off hours, and they came with an urgency because the king needed to know about his dreams. And when Daniel got a chance to explain all this, one of the first things he says is that God gave you this experience that you may understand what was going through your own mind. You didn't even understand your own mind, but God sent you this to gain wisdom, which was a hopeful kind of sentence, that God alone can read the mind. He wants to explain things to Nebuchadnezzar to give him greater wisdom. Well, only someone who could tell that dream could be trusted with the interpretation. And so when the Magi appeared, he says, I need you to tell me what I've dreamed. And they said, well, that's a rare thing. Nobody's ever been able to do that, and you're asking us to do that? Now, one of the urgencies behind Nebuchadnezzar's demand in his culture, there are aphorisms that are written down in the libraries of Babylon, and one of them was this: if a man, not just the king, but if a man forgets his dream, it signifies his God is angry with him. So from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, he's been blessed by his gods of this time, but now with the forgetting of the dream twice given, he's thinking that he's in really big trouble with his gods. He's terrified of something that should not give anyone any terror, but his real terror began when he woke up and he realized his God was very angry with him. Well, far from that, when Daniel explained it to him, your God isn't angry with you. He wants to talk to you, and he wants you. First, you have to exhaust all the false ways of getting to wisdom, and then he will allow you to experience the true way to get wisdom. So the men, they admitted defeat from the beginning. There's not a man on earth who can do what the king has asked. And it was very rational, very logical, but it fed into Nebuchadnezzar's suspicions that they have been hornswoggling. Can I use that garden variety word, hornswoggling the king? They've been pulling the wool over his eyes. They've been making up stories. They've been spinning interpretations. They've been manufacturing plausibilities. And he realizes that they think they're smarter than he is, and he doesn't like their condescending attitude one bit. And so now that he's got them and they failed, he wants to drill them, and so he does. He tells them to leave his presence, and he is sent out basically he said, go home, get ready to die, because I'm going to send an executioner after you. When Daniel eventually appeared before the king, well, he repeats the same truth that the Magi did. He's a Magi. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery the king is asking about, but there is a God in heaven. Testimony time. He talks about, here is a source of wisdom you haven't been thinking about yet. There is a God in heaven. And notice how he very politely and politically correctly says, not the God of heaven, but a God, because Nebuchadnezzar is a polytheist, and he's just... Daniel's just speaking of the true God as perhaps the one he has yet to learn about. But there is a God of heaven who reveals mysteries. So we live in an age, we don't look for the pantheon of gods. We oftentimes don't resort to looking to God for wisdom. We celebrate human wisdom. We have books and libraries, and we get human counselors. We pay big money to therapists, human minds, to help us patch up our mind, help us get our act together, and all these kind of things. We rely on humanity rather than on divinity to resolve our biggest issues. But some of life's most determinative mysteries will stay unsolved unless we let God in, because God in heaven is the only source that can reveal some of the answers we need, and he only gives them if we're pure in heart. We can't play games with God on this, but he will answer us if we ask him. So, the twinning of the same identical dreams. It's actually one dream occurring twice. King's memory lapse occurring becomes evidential support to this thesis that the dream actually was caused by God. It's a divine origin. It wasn't just a random too much cheese pizza too late at night. It's something God is doing here. The vacated memory trace becomes a criterion for an objective test or competency, because anybody can spin a yarn about what a dream means if you're given enough symbols. But if you can reconstruct the symbol sequence out of nothing, then you can certainly tell what the symbols mean. And so the interpretation rests upon the ability to reconstruct the dream, and they couldn't do it. And so when the king demands, tell me the dream, and I'll know you can interpret it, that's logical. He's actually getting wise about some of the shenanigans of his workforce. They've been manipulating circumstances to their own benefit at times. Well, the narrative of chapter 2 of the book of Daniel goes something like this. It's a chiasm. You see the X in the middle of the slide, which lets us know there's movement. There's logical movement in Daniel's recounting of this dream. He starts with A, and he starts with the first 13 verses, elaborating the experience of Nebuchadnezzar and his forgotten dream. Then we go laterally to point B. It leads him to a point where Daniel is now involved, and so Daniel prays that he might get the dream too. Then we move down to the lower left, B1, that corner. Daniel has had the dream, and he now is before the king and is revealing the dream to the king. And then lastly, we find the last 3 verses of the grand chapter that the king is doing the same thing that Daniel's doing. Daniel met this life circumstance with prayer, and lastly, Nebuchadnezzar has learned the power of prayer, and he is praying at the end of this chapter. Very interesting how it starts with a problem, it goes with a prayer, it ends with the solving of the problem, and it ends with a prayer of thanksgiving and appreciation. So let's jump into the middle of this sequence, because he's under duress. Daniel has missed that first appointment, and so he has a little bit of logic and leverage on his side that please give me some time. First, I wasn't here, didn't know this was a problem. Secondly, they are right. There's no human solution to this, but if you give me some time, my God, if he chooses to favor you and me with this, my God can reveal this to me, and I can reveal it to you. That was a new thought to Nebuchadnezzar, that God might work that way. But it sounded logical, so he gave him that time. And so on that night, Daniel's 3 friends all joined in prayer with him, and then they all went to bed. But Daniel was the one chosen to receive that dream. And he comes back, and let's look at that symmetry. There's a little more in symmetry that we hadn't really seen before, that it begins with 3 dialogues with the king and the Magi, the kings and the Chaldeans. And it's a frustrating dialogue because it's not getting anywhere. The king is asking them for help, and they're saying, we can't help you. So finally, it leads to a climax in point B, where the Nebuchadnezzar gives what I call his resolution is anger, and he gives a command to leave, and he's going to have them all put to death. Well, in contrast, Daniel enters in knowing that there's this issue for the first time, and he answers that crisis with prayer. He doesn't engage in argumentation, but he makes humbly 3 requests. Again, Daniel's a servant, Nebuchadnezzar the king. The king is sort of being demanding. Daniel's being, he's asking, he's pleading for the help. And in the end, he gets that prayer to God is going to be answered. Just imagine what was like for Nebuchadnezzar on that morning after, when Daniel has been announced. He's going to be coming in, and he's wondering what's going to be happening with this young new Magus, Daniel, the one he called Belteshazzar. And he looks at him as he coming around the corner, entering the court there. Probably does he look cocky? Does he look smug, like one of his magi was used to looking, like we know it all? And did he look? No, he didn't look cocky. Well, did he look anxious? Did he have a little telltale furrow on his brow that he knows that its time is up, but he's not really ready to answer? No, he doesn't look anxious. Does he look confident? Well, yes, he does look quietly confident and poised. Then more importantly, the king says, did he get the answers? Did he really get the answers? Because I gather that Nebuchadnezzar really didn't like killing people. He'd rather reward people, but he had to let people know they couldn't play games with him, and so if it was an unrewarding interchange, it would be a negative one. The next few minutes we're going to determine much, and so there he is, and literally on the edge of his throne. His poise is out the window, and he's listening for every word that Daniel's going to say. Daniel starts out, you were thinking, as you were trying to fall asleep, you were thinking about the future of your kingdom. You were thinking about how to make it last forever and how it could maintain itself after you personally were off the scene of leadership. That's what you were thinking. You wanted your kingdom to endure. You didn't want it to fold and have it be your people become prey to some other people coming in. And that's the good part. The other part was you were hoping it would last forever. And so you would be glorified. That's what you were thinking. And God sent you the dream to give you your answer. Oh, so now, why did I forget it then? Well, this is for your well-being. The well-being of many others is who are going to live after you. And the true God sets up kings and takes down kings, removes them at times and lets somebody else be a king. And you need to understand that's not your domain, is to make your kingdom last forever, because God will continue to be God and he will be in charge of the affairs of mankind. In your dream, however, you saw an image of a man, Babylonian man, a king, much like you. But this man, this image of a man, was standing there, and it's a static image, but he's made of metals, and there's a head of gold and all this, and it goes down to feet, part of iron and part of clay. That's what you saw. And so we looked at this, and as he begins to describe this, the king says, that's exactly what I saw. And he said, you're the head of gold. And for just a moment, Nebuchadnezzar is gratified because he's recognized as the head. He's recognized as gold, and that everything that comes after him is going to be as of less worth. Silver is not as valuable as gold. Bronze is not as valuable as gold or silver, and so on down till you get this mixture of the feet, which is part ceramic and part iron. Not much there to talk about as far as the feet's value. And he's watching, and there's something else that happened. This up till now, this image has been static. It's just standing there. But then he sees from a distance a stone is starting to move. It's coming out of, we would say, thin air, or out of a mountain, whatever he saw at a distance, but there was nobody there to get it going, and suddenly it comes flying at the image, strikes the image at the feet, and the whole image implodes and becomes like dust and blows away. And then this stone starts to grow until it's so big it fills the whole earth. What's that mean? Well, let us anchor ourselves in this lesson of history and dynasties, that we're living in this age of the feet, where there are strong kingdoms, there are weak kingdoms, fragile kingdoms, and it's right before the stone kingdom. That's where we are in all this, because all the other dynasties are gone. So he tells them, you were watching till that stone you saw was cut out without hands, struck the image on the feet of iron and clay, broke them in pieces. And watch, as the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the earth. Now he said that is the only eternal kingdom there's ever going to be, and that's God's kingdom. So just rest assured, you're great among men, but you're not as great as God. So now we look at this one more time, and we see the same chiastic structure explained, more details added, but this time we want to draw your attention to that B on the outline, which has to do with Daniel's explanation of the dream. He starts first with the exposition. You were watching, you were the one seeing all this. Now this is what it means. What you saw, this is what it means. The God of heaven has given you a kingdom, and the God of heaven has also reserved a kingdom for himself. And you have your turn for have a kingdom, but the God's going to have his turn to have a kingdom, and that's coming at the end. He's going to set it up, and it'll be the eternal kingdom when he sets his up. All the human dynasties are just predecessors to God's kingdom. At the end of this, of course, the king makes 3 individual actions. In the beginning, he started out with 3 dialogues, 3 speeches. He ends up with 3 actions. He falls prostrate on the floor in front of Daniel. He worships Daniel as being more worthy than him, more connected to the gods than he is. And he answered Daniel, and then he promoted Daniel at the end for his service. So we're not here to document this prophetically. We're here to analyze the wisdom of all this. Number one, the true God reveals secrets. You have no no reservation when human wisdom is at its end that you ought to do what Daniel did, is to kneel in prayer and ask God for wisdom, and he will grant you wisdom, because the true God interacts with people. He interacts with and within human history, and everything that he will do for you, he will do in accord to his plan for you to be ready for his kingdom, because he wants you in his kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar is worshiping as best he knows. He's still a pagan. He's not converted. He's convicted of a number of new ideas. He's aware of how much, or at least some of what he yet to learn. He chooses to honor Daniel above everyone else in his kingdom, even his lifetime servants, lifetime magi. They must fall behind him. He is going to be in charge of all the magi. And so Daniel becomes lifted up and rewarded for his service to the king. There's an enormously powerful judgment message in this story, because God sits in judgment of earthly monarchs. Sometimes they think, and we think, they get away with murder. They don't have any answer to God. But this story says that every one of them actually is accountable to God, and they will face God's judgment on how they utilized human power, governmental privilege, etc. And also, even the commoners are going to be included in this judgment, because God is going to sit in judgment over all the earth. You're going to face it. I'm going to face it. We live in a generation where, if you listen to the media, there is a new kind of paradox. It uses human engineering ideas, but it also is mindless at the same time, because it's as though there are people who believe you can do what you want and there will never be a consequence. Only weak people face consequences. If you know how to access human power and all this, you will never face a consequence. And so we have seen that in recent months, that there are people that don't feel like they have to face any consequences for their decisions, true or false. We would like to remind you that this story says that everyone must face the consequences of their decisions. Notice that although Nebuchadnezzar is not converted, he's not proclaimed Daniel's God the only God, and he doesn't say he's going to serve him, but the seed has been planted, and God is left to wait for that seed of truth to grow in his heart until it takes control over his mind, his affections, and his whole wisdom center. And I thought about this. Now, I have been privileged, and I'll say that because I do believe that I was privileged to grow up in a Bible-believing Christian home. I grew up in the church. I didn't spend a lot of my youth chasing a lot of the, we might say, the temptations the devil offered, but I chased a few. Because just knowing God and knowing He's a true God doesn't necessarily mean I'm ready yet to serve Him fully. Maybe you remember a few times where you knew better than what you chose to do. I'm not here to belittle you. I'm just a point of wisdom that whenever you choose to do what you know is wrong and outside of God's plan, you're evidencing to God your heart is not fully converted. As a fully converted person delights to serve God and doesn't think can anything good come from failing to serve God. And so God has to wait for our own human wisdom to grow to realize that some of our decisions have definitely been dead-end attempts to get around God's will for us. There's no answer there. So my question for us today as a wisdom point, when will I let the judgment message of God's plan of salvation alter our destiny? Because this was a destiny-altering vision. If we don't have our destiny altered, the law of sin and death will operate. We'll sin and then we'll die. The Bible's very clear, and that's the gospel. It's the everlasting gospel. And it's good news because sin that would last forever would mean there's something negative that is a part of life forever. And I would like to get past all the negatives of life. I don't know about you. I get to live in where life has no pain, no death, no suffering, no victimization, no theft, none of those evil kind of passions that disrupt your own inner peace. I would like to live a life that is totally at peace with God's will for me. Same end of that. But God is waiting for you and I to say our own amen to that He will change the trajectory from the law of sin and death determining the outcome of our life to that of everlasting life. You're in charge of that moment when the trajectory changes. Holy Spirit is just with you as it was with Nebuchadnezzar. You may not have it in a dream, but you'll have it in an intense or a quiet speaking to your mind. It's time to do business with God today. Quit putting it off. Search me, O God. You can say, you don't have to, but this is the winner's edge. This is the wisdom that you can find in the book of Daniel. Search me, O God, know my heart. Be like a Nebuchadnezzar and let that experience, although it was really forgettable for him to begin with, it became memorable for him that God was knowing his heart and is informing it and giving wisdom for it. Test me, know my thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life. See, that's God's plan, is for you to have that moment. It's not a king's mind God wants to read. It's yours.